Thank you, Jay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Thunderbird School of Global Management and our Summer Global Speaker Series. I want to also welcome all of our friends, family, and community members, alumni that are joining us online live right now. No one be nervous. I'll try not to be. My name is Amber Stenbeck, and I'm the Senior Director of Enrollment Management here at Thunderbird. And you're joining us this evening for an event that has become a tradition at Thunderbird. But we have cranked it up a notch this year, and I'd like to recognize someone in the audience tonight that has been a part of helping us with that. A very special partner and VIP guest, and one of the reasons why we've moved to the AT&T Auditorium versus the Yount. If you could please join me in welcoming from the Phoenix Business Journal, our esteemed partner, Rhonda Pringle. Thank you. Thank you for being here and everything that the Phoenix Business Journal has done to partner with us on this. We're really, really excited about that. Okay, before we get started, I do have a couple of quick housekeeping options. How many of you saw the glass fishbowl out front? Okay, we are going to do a very incredible, wonderful drawing for a Thunderbird swag bag. That bowl is going to be coming down to join me, and if you haven't put your business card in there, if you haven't put your name on the piece of paper, if you don't have a business card, I want to make sure that you do that, because at the end of our session tonight, we will be drawing for the most incredible prize you've probably ever won in your life. All right? Coming soon, virtual drawing for those of us joining online to be determined at a future date. Okay, so that's one thing. After our wonderful session tonight, we want to also invite all of you to join us at our pub for some wonderful food, networking. I see one of our alumni saying yes now, and to join us to celebrate this session. This is our first of 4 in the global speaker session. And also we will be having our tables in the lobby with our admissions team and our team from executive education there to answer any questions that you might have about Thunderbird, our programs, our offerings, or any other questions that we can answer for you. As you may or may not know, Thunderbird has been the leader in educating global leaders for over 70 years. So we're very excited to host this tonight. As I mentioned, our first of 4, May, June, July, and August. So let me introduce to you a little bit of information about our featured speaker tonight, who will be presenting on globalization in uncertain times. I feel very privileged to introduce this gentleman, who is not only our CEO and Director General, but an award-winning researcher, a acclaimed professor and faculty contributor to students for over 28 years. Not just here at Thunderbird, where he was a wonderful visiting professor, but at esteemed and highly reputable institutions such as IMD and NCIAD, Harvard School of Business, University of Michigan, and many more. He is someone that has published, co-authored or authored 11 books, over 60 articles, and case studies. He's consulted globally with companies such as ExxonMobil, Nissan, General Motors, World Bank. There's many, 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 many to list. We are really excited to have him kick off this series tonight, and very proud to call him our fearless leader. I'd like to bring to you now our CEO and Director General, Dr. Alan J. Morrison. Please welcome.
Thank you. You're awesome. Thank you, Amber. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to see so many friends of Thunderbirds and Thunderbird, and to meet some of our recent graduates and some of our graduates from many decades ago. Welcome back. This school, as Amber mentioned, is now it's more than 70 years. It's 71 years old. And if you can imagine what this place was like 71 years ago, it's pretty amazing to think where we are today. And as Amber said, we're regarded around the world as the leader in global management. And what better time to talk about globalization and uncertainty than today? We all, I think, are feeling it. And so I'd like to kind of put this in context and cover a few themes over the next hour or so. I hope that I can engage your minds. I hope I can engage your hearts and your intellect. But at the end of the day, I hope we can instill in you a desire to go out and to make a difference, because we need you to make a difference in the world today. So in the session over the next hour or so, we're going to talk about the nature of uncertainty around us. What is it all about? Why do we feel in many ways anxious or uncertain about the future? We're going to talk about how globalization and technology have come together as part of the fabric of uncertainty, and we're going to talk about what we can do about it, and how we can build organizations, and how we as individual leaders can act and to help others manage this very difficult and uncertain era in which we live. So we have a lot of ground to cover. At the end of the session, I'm going to open it up. If there's any questions that you have, I'd be happy to engage with you. And we'll see how the time goes and see how many questions we can fit in. But I'd be very, very happy if we could have a dialogue to discuss some of these really difficult and challenging topics. So let me start by talking about technology. One of the things we know as we look at the history of the world, as we study technology and technological change, is that the rate of technological change is increasing. If we went back 800, 1,000 years, we would see technology change was very, very slow, even glacial. And so we look at some of these technologies that today we're not even sure we would call technologies, but way back when they were big innovations. Things like having a saddle on a horse. I mean, today we would think that's nothing, but going back to 300 and 400 BC, this was a huge invention. By the way, what's the advantage of having a saddle other than it's a little more comfortable? But what are some advantages in having a saddle on a horse? Yeah. Absolutely. You can hold a spear or a sword, and it gave militaries huge advantages. Nevertheless, it took the Romans 600 years of losing battles to adopt that technology. So it's just a list of some of the technologies: gunpowder, longbows, and so on. And as time progresses, we see that the rate of technological change and proliferation of technologies is speeded up. So approximately 100 years to proliferate other technologies. As time kind of creeps by, the rate of technological change increases. Let me share with you some other data on this. So this is the number of years it took for the population of the United States, just 25% of us, to embrace these technologies. Just 1 out of 4 of us. So, for example, electricity took 46 years for 1/4 of the United States to be using electricity regularly. Telephone, 35 years. Radio, 31 years. Television, 26 years. I guess they didn't have good content back then. Personal computers, 16 years. Mobile phones, 13 years. The web, 7 years. So you see the kind of pattern. let's take a look at the last century. So in 1900, just 117 years ago, less than 10% of American families owned a stove or had access to electricity or phones. 1915, less than 10% of Americans even owned a car. In 1930, less than 10% of Americans owned refrigerators or clothes dryers. 1945, less than 10% of families owned, washers and now clothes dryers or air conditioning. 1960, less than 10% of families owned dishwashers or color TVs. And I remember growing up in the 60s, we did not have a dishwasher. We didn't get a color television until 1969. 1975, less than 10% of families owned a microwave. In 1990, less than 10% of families had cell phones or access to the internet. And so, with this kind of rapid uptake of technology, has also come a rapid generation of knowledge. And I want to talk to you a little bit about knowledge. There was a very famous writer and researcher, his name was Buckminster Fuller. He introduced what was called the knowledge doubling curve. So again, we're talking about technology change. I'm just talking for a minute about knowledge. And what he noticed was that about 100 years ago, in 1900, human knowledge was doubling about every century. And when you think of knowledge, think of something you can digitize and put in a book. So now there's other kinds of knowledge, but he's talking about digitized knowledge. So the size of that book doubled about every 100 years. Pretty big book. By the end of World War II, knowledge was doubling every 25 years. Today, we know that there are different types of knowledge, and the rate of knowledge doubling varies from industry to industry. So nanotechnology, the knowledge of that's about every 2 years. Clinical knowledge is doubling faster. But the total kind of repository of knowledge today is doubling about every 13 months. Every 13 months. Think about that. Now, what does this mean and what are the implications? Well, one of the things that we know is that knowledge generation is closely tied to advances in technology. The more technology advances, the more knowledge is produced. So, one example, Google. Some of you probably know all of these things that Google knows about you. If you don't, I hope this won't surprise you. But Google knows pretty much everything there is to know about you. They know your age, your gender, where you live, your primary language, who you contact, how frequently you email them, what you buy, who provides your health insurance, what type of computer you own, what websites you frequent, your political orientation, and every other orientation you may have. They also know or can easily figure out whether you're depressed or happy in a particular day of the week. They know what music you like. They might even know you better than you know yourself. Now, here's another aspect of technology, and that's just to illustrate, and that's what your doctor might know about you. And it's amazing what your doctor can know about you with just a little bit of testing. So one of the things that's become very hot and quite frankly fascinating, and we're seeing it being commercialized. Have you seen these ads for your DNA testing and so on? So there's a firm called Veritas Genetics. In the year 2001, if I wanted my DNA studied and I wanted to sequence my genome, it would have cost about $100 million. And it would have taken about 4 years for that work to be conducted. Today, this company in California can do it for $1,000. And you can get the results back in less than a week. Now, because of that, the technology, you're now seeing the accumulation of vast repertoires or repositories of knowledge. Think of how much data is included in one person's genome. So you want to know why knowledge is doubling, not every 100 years or 25 years, but now every 13 years. It's because of stuff like this. Let me give you one other example of this, and this is a company or technology that's very well known in Japan. I know we have at least one Japanese student here. You've probably heard of C-mode technology. These are very smart, intelligent devices that we call vending machines, but they're more computer than vending machines. And they're pretty much everywhere in Japan. The Japanese, like probably no other culture, seem to love vending machines. You can buy, I swear you could buy a car or a house in a vending machine over in Japan. But this is a story about Coca-Cola vending machines. The bottler of Coca-Cola in Japan, interestingly, is the most profitable bottler on a per unit basis of any bottler in the world. And it actually has very little to do with what they do in Atlanta, Georgia. It has everything to do with what they're carrying out in Japan. And that's to use this technology. The technology is tied to NTT Docomo phones. If you have one of these phones, those vending machines know where you are, each vending machine, and they're all networked together. So if I'm walking down a sidewalk in Tokyo or Osaka, Japan, that vending machine knows where I am. It's also a smart machine because it knows what time of the day is, it knows what the temperature is, it knows what the traffic conditions are, and it probably knows if I'm in a hurry or not, and it probably knows actually where I'm going because it has access to my calendar. And so because of all of that knowledge and the technology, it is able to essentially telephone me with the message, I am the vending machine, 2 meters ahead on your left, okay? And because it's so smart, and because it's able to crunch the databases that it has, because of what it knows about you, it can predict what kind of soft drink you want at what time of day when the temperature is at a certain level. And it can then either promote that product, give me a discount, or give me a coupon that ties into some social event, that maybe it's a concert, maybe it's some event at a club or whatever, because it knows who I am. So this is the marriage of technology and knowledge. The accumulation of knowledge married with technology transforms our lives, but it also can scare the, what's the word, bejeebers, that's it, I was looking for the word, out of us, and make us anxious. Here's another example of this. One company, General Electric. General Electric is a major producer of industrial sensors. These are sensors that are installed in aircraft engines or washing machines or combine harvesters or sewing machines or I don't know what, bowling alley pin rotating machines. They're everywhere today. So General Electric, 150,000 sensors in medical devices that are tied to the internet, smart devices. 36,000 embedded in jet engines, and you can see the list. And every one of those sensors is pumping out data. In some cases, 60 frames a second. In other cases, 1,000 a second, or literally 1,000 a second in some high-speed devices. Now, why would any company want to do this? Why would I want so much data? Because the data helps me make better decisions, and it helps me to predict when the next machine failure will take place, helps me assess what the pressure is in the engine so I can adjust it in real time, helps me produce more with fewer breakdowns, and helps me to anticipate what customers want. So this is all going on around us. Can we stop this? I don't think so. How do we feel about it? I think we're just kind of coming to grips with this. One of the implications of this, from a corporate perspective, is it's scrambling, if you will, the board and culling out the old giants of the past and replacing them with an entirely new breed of corporate leaders. So, in the year 2001, this is the Fortune 500 companies. Of the top 5 companies in the world, 1 was a technology company. Today, those 4 that were in the top 5 have all fallen off the list. Every single one of these companies is a new wave company, which is either technology or software, or is entirely dependent on its success on big data, data analytics, knowledge management. In 15 years. The world has changed in 15 years. Now, does that make people feel uncertain? Well, it certainly would if I was working for General Electric or Exxon or Citi or Walmart. I'd feel a little bit uncertain. Where are we going? And if I was working for these big companies on the bottom, I would also wonder, where are we going? And will I be taken along for the ride, or will I be left behind in the dust? Now, not only is this happening with Fortune 500 companies, but with the top of those companies, but this is happening not just with the 5 or the top 10 or the top 20 or the top 50 or the top 1. It's happening to the top 500 companies. It used to be in the 1920s that once you made it to the list, this is the Standard & Poor 500. Once you made it to that list, you practically never left the list. You'd be on that list for the average was 75 years, which means that you could have 2 careers, your company would still be there. So you go work for one of these big monolithic companies, it was going to be around for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. It was going to be around. And then it started to drop. By the 60s, it was 33 years, 20 years. Then it's dropping. If the trend continues, it's going to be down to about 14 years. 14 years. So you're going to have this giant race, to be big, and you're going to land on your derriere in, on average, 14 years, which means average is in the middle, so half of them are out of business or fallen off the list in, 7, 8, 10 years? They're gone. Now, does this make people uncertain and anxious? Well, certainly if you work for the companies, what if you supply those companies? What if you spent years cultivating relationships with those companies? And they're gone. So, as I mentioned earlier, the rate of change is technology, and I would also add globalization, which we'll talk about next. But as that's moving up exponentially, our ability to adapt, humans do adapt. But we don't adapt as fast as the world is changing. And so we have this world in which it's changing faster than we as mere mortals can adapt. We've got all this technology, all of this knowledge, all of this data. It's flowing over us, and we can barely figure out how to use 10% of our mobile phones. Right? Now, what are the repercussions? And I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to just share a couple of quotes with you. This is from Thomas Friedman. He said, "When fast gets really fast, being slower to adapt makes you really slow and disoriented." And from Astro Teller, who runs the Google X Research Development Lab, he said, "If the technology platform for society can now turn over in 5 to 7 years, but it takes 10 to 15 years to adapt to it, we will all feel out of control because we can't adapt to the world as fast as it's changing. By the time we get used to the change, that won't even be the prevailing change anymore. We'll be on to something new. In the past, and this is the driver of uncertainty, in the past, knowledge about what was important, knowledge about the data we needed to collect, was pretty clear to everybody. You knew if you worked for a company or a big organization, you knew to pay attention to things like what was your market share, the size of the market, or what were your revenue growth targets, or what was the size of the plants your competitor was using. These were all kind of signals. How's your company doing? And so business schools would teach you, give you all kinds of lessons in competitive analysis, assessing the strengths of a competitor, looking at their strategies, understanding where the market was. How big was it after all? What share of the market do we have? And everybody knew that those were kind of legitimate targets. And they're legitimate targets for business schools, teaching students. Let me give you your kind of portfolio of skills, students. You learn these, you're going to do great. But they're also important in the job, in the company you work for. We have a marketing department. We have a finance department. Here are all the things you need to do. And so the leaders of those departments would go through the checklist. Here are the 10 things. Are you doing number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5? And if you miss number 5, go back to school and learn that skill. And everybody accepted that. It's what we call a paradigm. Everybody knew what the questions were, and they probably knew what the answers were. The problem now is that the data is so complicated that really nobody understands it, not in its totality. You have little clusters of kind of brainiac, nerd-like people who can parse data in certain ways. They can get a little piece of it, but they don't have the big picture. It's not only that it's complicated and complex, it exceeds the mental ability of any one leader to figure out. You can't know. And it's not your fault for once in your life. It's not your fault. It's just the way it is. And so these are what we really call the uncertain times. And they're probably not going away. Now, technology and technology change is closely associated with globalization, which is something else I wanted to talk about. Maybe surprising as you come to Thunderbird that we would want to mention globalization, but I can't resist. As Amber said, I've written 11 books on globalization and a ton of articles, and it's something I care about. So let me talk a little bit about globalization. And the first question is, how do you define globalization? I want to give you the definition, okay? This is the perfect way of capturing globalization. The best way I can think of, and that's the death of Princess Diana. You remember her? In all her glory, poor woman died in the arms of Dodi Fayed. It was so sad. So, Princess Diana's death characterizes globalization like no other example I can think of. Why? She's an English princess with an Egyptian boyfriend who crashed in a French tunnel, driven in a German car with a Dutch engine, with a Belgian who was drunk on Scottish whiskey, followed closely by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles, treated by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, presented to you by a Canadian, actually I'm also American, using US-designed software, coded in India, presented on a computer using Taiwanese chips, and a Korean projector assembled by Malaysian workers in a Singapore plant, transported by Bangladeshi truck drivers, hijacked by Indonesians, unloaded by Sicilian longshoremen, and trucked to you by Romanian illegals, and that is the definition of globalization. No offense to our Sicilian participants here. Now, globalization has, as we talk about, uncertainty because of technology, globalization has also shuffled the deck for companies. There have been big winners and losers. And the big winners, numerically, in terms of corporate presence, has been the Chinese. The biggest losers, this is the Fortune 500, global Fortune 500 list, the biggest country in terms of number of losers is Japan. The U.S. is number 2 on the loser list in terms of number of companies that have fallen off the top 500 list. Now, is that bad news or good news? We'll talk about that. But certainly this has been disruptive for good and not so good for American companies. Now, not all industries are as influenced by globalization as others. Generally speaking, industries that have very high levels of trade, shipping goods from country A to country B, these are industries we typically think of as the most global industries. So here are some of the most global, from semiconductors down to beer and software entertainment, tires and rubber and so on. So some of these industries are highly influenced, others are less influenced. Now, what are the benefits of globalization? What are they? Let me describe a few. One of those, which I think we often forget as we almost instinctively push back against the Chinese. 40 years ago, we were all concerned about starvation in China. What could we do? Well, the best antidote was globalization. Globalization brought about 800 million Chinese out of poverty. In India, it created almost a doubling of the middle class over a period of about a dozen years. 550-odd million middle-class Chinese, nearly doubled because of globalization. And so no matter what kind of judgment we have about globalization, let's not forget that in just 2 countries, 1.2, 1.3 billion people have been impacted significantly. And think about the impact on death rate and disease and misery that has been abated because of globalization. And we're just talking about 2 countries. Now, in the developed countries, the OECD, which is the Organization of Export Cooperation and Development, OECD, these countries, the more advanced countries, the researchers believe that a 10% increase in trade from the country will generate a 4% increase in gross national product. The more trade a country has, the richer the population is. For consumers, the benefits are lower cost, more choice, higher quality, better technology. One study found that the net impact in your pocketbook in the United States was $13,600. You, me, my children, so, add it all up, okay? A massive impact, $13,600 per family in the United States. Significant. Another study found that as we talk about job loss, and there are always winners and losers in life, right? It's rarely a system that generates 100% winners. But one study just completed in the last couple of weeks, major study, found that the ratio of job gains to losses in the United States because of trade liberalization, the ratio was 5 new jobs gained, 1 new job or 1 job lost. It's pretty good ratio, isn't it? Pretty good. Why the benefits? I think if I were to use one and only one reason, and there's a big long list, but if they're at the top of the list, and the one reason that I would talk about is this curve right here, which is called the economy of scale curve. And we see this happening in industry after industry after industry after industry. And that curve tells us that the greater the volume of production, the lower the unit cost. And how do we get large volumes of production? We sell the product around the world. And if you can kind of get your head around that very basic concept, you will understand why companies love globalization. I said there's other reasons too. But at the very top of the list, it's this curve. Now, some industries, the curve is flat. In other industries, it's incredibly steep. But the steeper the curve, generally, the higher the technology, or certainly the higher the capital associated with that industry. Now, there are facilitators in addition to technology and the ability of technology to make production more efficient. Communications is also allowing us access to what's going on in different markets. You know, I've been to China, I don't know how many times. 50 times. When I first started to go to China towards the latter part of the 1980s, you would not recognize the country that it is today. The Shanghai domestic airport, I kid you not, had a big part of the floor that was dirt in that airport. There was one store that would take foreign currency through foreign exchange certificates. One store. Today, you wouldn't recognize it. I was in Paris 10 days ago, and I went to one of the fancy department stores for research purposes. And your gift will be coming in the mail, Amber. Jimmy Choo's. And one of the kind of best known and most respected department stores is a store called Galeries Lafayette. Beautiful store. It's kind of like Harrods, but I think I like it better. They have little mini stores, and they have Cartier and Coach and Ferragamo and, Louis Vuitton. Louis Vuitton in Paris has a rope line. And in that rope line, snaking around half of the floor, were people lining up for their little space in the store. And what nationality were, as far as I could tell, like 100% of the people in line? Chinese. Chinese. 40% of the world's luxury market is now owned by the Chinese. I'm not necessarily sure why they like those products, but the markets have shifted dramatically. And it's because of communication. It's because of the ability in real time for them to connect with Western products, Western services, and create Western expectations. National culture is slowly degrading. Not going to disappear, but the differences that separate the Germans and the French and the Americans and the Chinese and the Japanese are little by little eroding. And that, my friend, is one of the outcomes of globalization. It can be viewed as good or bad. It's just what it is. One example here of how this is transforming business. The company used to be known as the Limited Brands. They changed their name to L Brands. They are owned by a guy named Lex Wessner, who founded Victoria's Secret. They've now proliferated into other brands, other products. Their supply chain used to be when you ordered, you're dealing with fashion, you put your order in. You start working on your order 8 months before you expected the products to arrive, and the orders actually went in about 6 months, and it took the factory 6 months to fill the supply chain. They're now able to do it in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, anywhere around the world. And this is not just place an order. This is to go from design to manufacture to assembly to shipping to stacking the store shelves in 2 weeks. This is the Zara notion of fast fashion. And so this is part of the world we live in. Now, there's a dark side to this as well, as we talk about globalization. I'll just give you one example of this. Some of you may have read about it. It's actually the largest construction company in Brazil. It's called Odebrecht. And if you haven't been paying attention, let me tell you their story, because Brazil is kind of growing, and with all the growth and the Olympics, geez, we need sewers and electricity and roads and tunnels and bridges and office buildings and residential buildings, and the biggest construction company is Odebrecht in Brazil. What a great company, what a great opportunity. So sales start growing, only to discover after the fact that there was some, shall we call, grease money paid under the table. Now, what's interesting is that that money didn't just get paid in Brazil, where it brought down the president and probably the next president and many, many members of their elected house. But it's now proliferated because Odebrecht also became a huge construction company in Colombia, in Panama, in Argentina. And in fact, this scandal is now spread with bribes coming through this company to 10 different countries. A month ago, I met with the vice president of Guatemala. Guatemala, how far away from Brazil is that? Who told me that 1/3 of the congressmen in Guatemala were now under indictment for taking money from Odebrecht. And so as we look at kind of values, and isn't it wonderful we're all kind of embracing all these Western luxury goods and so on, there's a dark side to some of these values, that some of the negative practices, some of the things we might not be proud of, can also spread like wildfire from country to country to country to country. Now, another challenge, no surprise, given what we've seen about globalization, given what we know about uncertainty, but it's the rise of what we call populism. And this is, I think, in many ways, an emotional reaction to all of that uncertainty around us. And it's also a reaction to fear of where it's all going. I used to know, all about my company and my boss, and we all went to the same school together, and we had the same experiences, we laughed at the same jokes. And now look at the workforce. We have so many different cultures and values and microaggressions and all of this nonsense in the workplace. I don't want any of it. I want to go back to the way it was, or at least the way I thought it was. Today, 65% of countries in the world have minority populations exceeding 10%. Think about that. 100 years ago, that was not necessarily the case. And we're seeing the rise of what's called populism in what we call peak powers. These are the big, powerful countries, the Germanys, the U.S., and so on. Globalization is often blamed as the root cause of this. Those foreigners, those terrible foreign products are taking away our jobs. And so they'll bring a Japanese car and beat it with clubs as if the car was the problem. But it's also because of migration. And, I don't want to have a political discussion here, but illegal migration. Today in Jordan, 1 out of 4 people in that country are refugees. 1 out of 4. 4 million people have come into Europe over the last couple of years. And as a result of this, people feel, again, overwhelmed. Keep them out. Get them out of here. Let's kind of go back to the way it used to be, those good old days, right? And it's also, I think, created or exacerbated by a massive and growing trust gap that we have with government. And this is not, people say, United States, Donald Trump, look where he is in the polls. Actually, compared to about 90% other countries, Trump's actually pretty good in the polls. Okay? From country to country to country, unless they just had an election and they're still on the honeymoon, think about where the leaders are ranking or how they're polling. Hollande went out of power at somewhere near 11% popularity. Think about what's happening in Japan and Korea, and think of what's happening in the UK and before Brexit, after Brexit. Think about all of the problems in terms of the trust and credibility gap. Nobody believes anybody anymore. And that's in part a result of this technology that we have, which allows you or I to say anything we want with impunity and have it copied and disseminated around the world instantaneously. We can make up anything we want. Maybe we believe it, but we can say anything we want, and so there are no institutional checks on information anymore. Now, as a result of this, I think we certainly face uncertainty and uncertain times. And corporations are left somewhat in the lurch. In one study, 95% of senior executives say that they doubt their companies have the right operating model for today's world. And because redesigning and restructuring the organization is difficult and costly and uncertain, and because the world of the future is so uncertain, let's just live with our rather awkward, gangly organizational structure, knowing that it can't do what we want it to do. And so there you are. And when I work in companies and talk to executives, one refrain I hear constantly, and it doesn't matter whether it's a big American company or German company or Dutch company or Japanese company, I hear the same thing all around the world. My company's broken, it does not work. Or my organization is broken, it does not work. The good news is they're saying the same thing across the street at the next company. They're saying the same thing in Johannesburg, they're saying it in Cairo, they're saying it in Dusseldorf, they're saying it in Osaka, they're saying it in Shanghai. They're all broken. And they're all broken because even the best leader can't create a structure that meets all of the needs of today. And so we will all live in somewhat broken companies. Let's talk about the implications here. So, who are your customers? Who are your company's owners? Do you even know anymore? And what do the owners want? Will all this investment in technology that your company's forking out for, will it ever pay off? One research study just produced by Ernst & Young in 2015 said about 72% of technology initiatives end up failing, meaning they never reached the potential that was used to make the decision to invest in that technology. How am I being evaluated? What does your boss think is important? Maybe he or she tells you, maybe they don't tell you. By the way, who is my boss anyways? Some people have 3, 4 bosses. Who are you listening to? Should I remain loyal to a company or organization that might not be around in 5 years? Should I treat foreign employees the same as U.S. employees? Should I shed a tear for that employee who gets laid off in Cleveland? But the guy who gets laid off in Bangalore, who cares about him because he's Indian? Or should I feel in my heart the same about employees all around the world? And how about how we treat employees? Should we treat them the same, the one in Cleveland as in Bangalore? Same benefits? Same respect? These are all big questions that the last generation probably didn't have to deal with. How do I even know what's right anymore? Because the world is so complicated. The standards are so different. The norms and expectations are so varied. What is my anchor? And how do I even know if that's the right anchor? Some observations. Globalization and technological change are not going away. They're not. All the picketing and demonstrating in the world and taking baseball bats to Japanese cars isn't going to change that. It's not going away. But how we access and think about the world, I think, is going to change, and that needs to change in ways that help us to engage and understand. We can't stay on the sidelines. We've got to be fighting. Don't listen only to the critics, because it's easy to be a critic. I want to just share a quote from Carlos Ghosn, who's the CEO of the Renault-Nissan Alliance and also the CEO of Mitsubishi Motors. He said, this is just 2 days ago at a conference, he said, I think we need to defend, explain, and market globalization. We assume that the benefits are so obvious that everyone will understand this. We've been wrong in many cases. Now, in order to stay ahead of the curve, let me close with a few kind of recommendations. One of those is about the organization and the need for us to build capabilities into the organization. And the second is a conversation about us as leaders or aspiring leaders. It's about helping us build our own capabilities to cope and to deal with and to help interpret all of that complexity for our employees. On the organizational front, if we want to build powerful organizations that can sustain us through these turbulent times, we need to think about bridging the gap between what we can do today and what we need to do tomorrow. And that means focusing on 5 core categories. As a leader, you need to constantly reflect on the structure of your organization. What does your structure enable you to do well, and what does it prevent you from doing? It's also about the people. Building capabilities is about building the competencies of your employees. Chances are, left to their own devices, they will stay at a status quo level, and most of them will not invest in developing their own capabilities. Why? Because you pay them to do their current job. You don't pay them to do the next job 2 or 3 years into the future. So why should they change? And so we need to be constantly assessing our people and their competencies and view those competencies as if they were true assets that need investing. Number 3 is a focus on the processes of the organization. Think about the processes or the systems. Think about the central nervous system of the body. Without good systems, the body doesn't work. And those systems are things like communication systems, IT systems, performance evaluation systems, reward systems. These constantly need to be tweaked and in some cases reinvented. Number 4 on the list is the culture of the organization. Do you have a culture that embraces change rapidly or one that resists change? Do you have a culture that embraces best practices or one that resists best practices? Do you have a culture which promotes due process and fairness and an appreciation for diversity and the benefits that come from diversity? Do you have a culture that promotes fast execution? And the final one is your leadership team. How strong, how cohesive, how aligned is your leadership team? You have the right people on the team. Are they not only doing a good job themselves individually, but are they doing a good job as a team? Sharing ideas, networking, driving politics out of the process. Now, each one of these topics is a big topic, and we could spend a lot of time discussing and drilling down and understanding and pulling the layers off of each one of these different aspects of organizational capability. But I promise you it is a good investment of your time, effort, and energy to think about and to tackle each one of these 5 categories of capabilities. In addition to that is the individual component. You as a leader. We know today in America, most on average of you who are going to find your careers in America will work for at least 12 different organizations between when you graduate from university and when you retire. 12. And so we could talk about building the organization, but at the end of the day, I mean, most of you probably think about yourselves, right? And building your own capabilities. As we think about building global leadership capabilities, we think first and foremost on drive. Are you actually motivated to do anything? Do you have the passion to get the job done? Do you have the passion to learn? I had a very interesting meeting about 3 weeks ago with a man named Hank Greenberg. Some of you may know that name. He was the man who really built up AIG and was certainly kind of the king of Wall Street for many decades. He has had some challenges over the last 10 years, but has come back in full force, moved out of his role as chairman and CEO of AIG to become chairman and CEO of another firm called CV Star. They now have 8,000 employees. Hank Greenberg, you may not know, is 91 years old. Hank Greenberg was on the beaches of Normandy. Hank Greenberg helped liberate Auschwitz in World War II. And so I met this kind of iconic leader, 91 years old, fascinating. I spent a half hour interviewing him 3 weeks ago. I shouldn't have my hand up here. Hank Greenberg's about that tall now. And if he'd just taken a shower and had wet hair, he might weigh 100 pounds. But he's as sharp as a tack. And I asked him, what was the key to his success? What did he say? You have to love what you do. He says, I'm 91 years old. I still make 4 trips a year to China. And I said, what's your typical work day like? He says, it's about 18 hours. I get 4.5 hours sleep a night. I'm the last person to leave the office every night, and I bring home a big stack of papers. And I work late into the night. How many days a week? Well, mostly 7 days a week. He says, you want someone who's going to be successful? Guess what? They're going to be somebody who works hard. And often we shortchange hard work. He's the poster child for hard work, Hank Greenberg. So do you have the drive? And I can't answer that question. I just want you to think about it. Do you have what you need to stay competitive? And if you don't, how motivated are you? Successful global leaders also have character. So they have the drive, and the drive kind of nurtures these other characteristics. One of those is character. Character is about ethics. It's about having high ethical standards and how you treat people and how you make decisions and how you perceive the benefits of decisions and the cost of decisions. Character is also about the ability to connect with people, particularly people who have different values and different cultures and who may live in different parts of the world and speak different languages. Can you connect emotionally with people? The second characteristic that I want to mention is what we call savvy. Savvy comes from the French savoir-faire, which is knowing how to do things. So we can be as gregarious and ethical and driven as we want to be, but unless we actually have skills as business leaders, we're not going to be worth a lot other than being a great drinking buddy and party friend, right? Do we have the organizational skills and the business skills? And the final one is the mindset. A global mindset. Thinking about the world as if it were a world devoid of many of the artificial barriers that we set up. Mindset is about how you perceive opportunities, how you perceive people, how you interpret what people think and what they do and what they say. That's a mindset. Having a global mindset is about perceiving the world as a world full of opportunities, not perceiving the world as a world of kind of death traps and something to be afraid of. Now, we want to welcome you to Thunderbird because these are all topics we spent a lot of time talking about and studying and addressing at Thunderbird. And as I mentioned when we started, Thunderbird has a long history, but I just want to share a few little data points with you. And these are very recent data points that have come out in the last literally few weeks. And it's some of our rankings, because the world knows Thunderbird. The world absolutely knows who we are and what we're about. I met 5 weeks ago with the former president of Sri Lanka, and she said, Thunderbird, oh, tell me all about Thunderbird. I've heard all about it. I would love to come and speak to Thunderbird students. I had a similar conversation at the same meeting with the former president of Switzerland, and then 10 minutes later, the former head of state for Austria. How's Thunderbird? They all know the school, but they know it because of our reputation. So just a couple of these things. I want to, if you'll just indulge me a minute, because I want to brag for a minute about Thunderbird. Ranked number 15 in the world in terms of our executive masters of global management. Number 15 in the world, that's number 4 in the United States. Number 1 in global experience, number 3 in prestige, number 6, we're ahead of schools like Oxford, Yale, MIT, Michigan, NYU, Stern, and so on. In Glendale, Arizona, who would have thought that, right? A couple other ones. One is our online Masters of Global Management. Online, number 6 in the world. Number 6. Non-degree executive education, number 23 in the world. And number 1 in the world for women engagement levels or women participation levels in executive programs. So there's a lot going on in little kind of sleepy Glendale, Arizona. This is the kind of crown jewel of the state of Arizona insofar as globalization is concerned, and really a crown jewel for the United States overall. We think that Thunderbird has a message that is important not just for Arizonans or Glendalites, or what is it, Glendale? Glendalians, kind of reptilian almost. We think it's a message that's important for all of the world to understand that with the right kind of implementation, the right compassion, the right forbearance and patience, and the right vision, globalization can help transform the world. It has, it will, it can, and we can play an important role in that process. So thank you for indulging me, and I want to open it up. I think we have a little bit of time if there's any questions that you might. And if I can't answer them, that's why we have Amber here. She can answer all those questions. Aaron and I. Okay. Thank you. Now, I think we're just going to have questions from the live group here, not the online. Not that they're not live, but...
Correct.
All right?
Questions. Who's first?
Well, I guess it's time for that fishbowl then, right? Sorry, there's one very enthusiastic. I believe your name is. Yeah, it's Alan. Yes, Alan. Go ahead.
Don't speak without the mic because then they can't hear. So, sorry. Let me run it back. I gave it to that gentleman. Here we go.
Alan, just please introduce yourself and then go
I'm
ahead with
Alan
the question.
Fisher. I'm head of our global commercial executive education team for Thunderbird. My question is, at the beginning of your presentation, Alan, you talked about the increase in knowledge, and I'm wondering if there's a correlation between that increase in knowledge and Moore's law that talks about the increase in technology and the speed with which we'll increase our technological capabilities.
I think they always thought Moore's law would reach its kind of ultimate conclusion and we'd kind of top out, but they continue to. You know what Moore's law is? The doubling of the capacitor processor speed. I think Andy Grove thought that it would tap out about 15 years ago, and it still continues on today, although it has slowed. I don't think we're going to see that with knowledge at all. I think the biggest worry is how do we capture all the knowledge that's being generated? Because at some point, it starts doubling not every 13 months, but every 13 days and every 13 hours, and I guess at some point, we have some other challenges that we're dealing with. And I suspect in 20, 30 years, we'll think about knowledge very differently than we do today. So. Yeah.
Hi,
Please introduce yourself. Yeah.
I will, thanks. My name is Andrew Cullen. I am an undergraduate student at the ASU West Campus. My question is, how do you think we can start to market globalization? Because it seems like it goes back and forth. Like a couple years ago,
Absolutely.
free trade was like a hot phrase you could put on a product.
Yeah.
But now it seems like nationalistic feelings are starting to increase again and people start going the other direction with it. How do you think we can begin to educate people and market globalization better?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're quite right. Whether it's globalization or any cause célèbre, it does tend to swing a little bit like a pendulum. And I think education is the key to that. Most people are it's not that they're uninformed, but I think a lot of people are just not interested in keeping track of this, and when they get informed, it's in little pulses and little bits, and so they consume information based on often biased media sites. And by the way, I could always blame media, but we self-select the media sites we go to. So we want to reinforce our assumptions and our beliefs. So if I'm kind of right-wing, I'll never go to MSNBC for information. And if I'm left-wing, I'll never go to Fox for information. So I'm not sure I blame the media as much as I blame us for not having an open mind and a broad perspective. But I think the public is subject, as it always is in every country, to the influence of leaders, whether they're national leaders or corporate leaders or state leaders or whoever. We tend to, as people, generally speaking, follow our leaders. And of course, there are many outliers and people who would rather die than follow a leader, but generally speaking, leaders have an influence. And so when you see Carlos Ghosn talk about the need for corporate leaders to talk about this, because they haven't. They have just simply said, well, everyone's smart enough to figure this out. Well, they're not figuring it out. Some are and some aren't. The problem that corporate leaders have is they're suspect. Nobody believes what they say because they're the rich, fat cats driving the big cars and driving and flying in the private jets. And so when they talk about, global warming and sustainability and the benefits of this, that, or the other, people look at them. Even if the argument is accurate, it's the messenger. And so those messengers, by their very position, even if they're the most thoughtful, wonderful people in the world, half the population will just discount them immediately. So how do we educate people? I think it's people like us. Now, I have I think, added credibility, not because of who I am, but because I'm a professor. Generally speaking, in terms of credibility in society, professors have a fair degree of credibility. But others are suspicious of professors. They speak these weird languages. What in the hell are they talking about? Who knows what's going on here? They just discard it. And so we can talk to some people, but you can talk to people. I think we all need to talk to people about this. Because if we don't talk about it, other people will. And other people will take this populist approach and they'll push, diversity out of the environment. They'll push the foreigners. I'm not saying we're going to put them on rail cars and drive them out of the country. We'll push them out of our social groups. We won't include them the same way. And don't think it can't happen in 3, 4, 5 years. And so we have to be very careful about this. But all of us have a different voice. I have a voice, you have a voice, politicians have a voice, corporate executives have a voice. We all have a voice. My message would be we all need to communicate in languages that people can understand. But we need to communicate with some passion and some conviction. I hope that helped. Yeah.
So my name is Alden Elric. I'm a local community member that's an advocate for Thunderbird. You talk about ethics and integrity. I know when Dr. Cabrera was the president here, they implemented a new oath of honor.
Yes.
So it's one thing to say that we do have that, and Thunderbird is a leader with the only maybe school that has that pledge. How do graduates demonstrate that without saying it?
Yeah.
And what's the role, and how does that really differentiate for Thunderbird?
Yeah, I think it was about 11 years ago Thunderbird introduced its oath of honor. We have an honor council at the school. Every graduation, we ask our graduates to sign the pledge, which is that they will live in accordance with the oath of honor. And this is about fairness and about equity and so on. I think it's a great thing to do. But this is a very, very difficult subject to teach, because you tend to teach concepts, you tend to teach ideas, but it's difficult to teach ethics and values. And one of the concerns that I have about teaching the subject of ethics is most professors come down to the point, mistakenly, of kind of preaching, here's the list of, basically thou shalt nots, this is bad, terrible, don't do this. And I think, to be honest, it's okay, I can learn that, I can pass the exam on that, but it's about judgment. It's about decision making. It's about trade-offs. And how do we understand ethics if it doesn't involve tough decisions? And those tough decisions are those gray areas where it's really difficult to know what the right thing to do is. I'll give you one example. I used to do a lot of consulting work when I was living in Canada. This is 12, 15 years ago, for a company called Maple Leaf Foods. They're the biggest food company in Canada. They're, chicken and poultry and dairy and, bakeries and pork and all. I mean, they're everywhere in the food chain. They have a factory north of Toronto that makes, frozen pizzas and pizza pockets. These are kind of basically a piece of pizza folded over. And they have 1,800 employees in the factory. And to get out of the factory, at the end of the day, they wear their white coats, they're working the factory, they take the coats off, they go through a security, there's a security guard who, kind of checking people as they go out. It was the winter time, and so they'd taken their white coats off, but they had winter coats on as they're leaving the factory. And there was an elderly employee, he was in his early 60s, but the average worker was in his early 30s. He walked out of past the security guard with a coat that was kind of bulked up like this, and he's kind of walking in an awkward way, and the security guard kind of says, hey, stop there, and he kind of walks a little bit faster, and so the security guard grabs him, kind of opens up his coat, and it's stuffed with these pizza pockets, okay? There's 30 of them stuffed in his jacket. Now, that company had an ethics policy, which was you cannot take, you can't steal. And if you're caught stealing, you're fired and there's no recourse. Okay? So it seems simple, doesn't it? Until they found out more about the guy. And in fact, it was the union that petitioned an appeal. And the president of the company, a guy named Michael McKay, initially said, forget it. The policy's the policy. He's a thief. Yeah, but you don't know the rest of the story. There couldn't be the rest of the story. I don't care what the rest of the story is. No, but you need to listen. The guy was 61 years old. He had worked for the company since he was 19 years old. In that time, he had missed only 1 day of work. 1 day of work. 2 months prior to this episode, his wife of 35 years or something had finally succumbed to cancer and died. And he was left depressed, still going to work, depressed. And when you're depressed, some people overeat, that's probably me, but he stopped eating. In part because he was depressed, in part because he didn't know how to cook. And so finally his colleagues had kind of encouraged him to the point where he was going to go ahead and start eating again. And these pizza pockets, every one of them, he had taken out of the dumpster in the back of the factory. They were seconds, they had been spoiled or discarded or had been flattened or whatever. Now let me ask you, what is the ethical thing to do? Think about it. So these are the kinds of tough decisions if you're a leader. How do you deal with that? And so when we teach ethics, it's not just about here's the list, don't steal and and be consistent in the application of the rules. It's how do you deal with these variations? And this is in Canada. Wait till you start adding different cultures and different nationalities in different parts of the world, how they perceive it. How do they perceive it? These are tough things. In the late 1980s, I wrote a whole case series on Kentucky Fried Chicken in China and how they opened their first 3 stores in Beijing, and it was a fabulous, interesting story. But one of the biggest problems they had in Kentucky Fried Chicken was global standards. For quality, service, and cleanliness. So KFC had a policy, corporate policy worldwide, that fried chicken could stay under the heat lamp for no more than, I think it was 9 minutes. And then you throw it out. What were the Chinese doing? They were making double, triple, quadruple batches of chicken so that it would get thrown out. And they were taking literally giant garbage bags of cooked chicken out to the dumpsters for their friends to slice them open to take the chicken home. But if you ask the Chinese employees, do you think that's an unethical thing to do? Their response is, no, I'll tell you what's unethical. It's unethical because KFC is paying me 10 cents an hour, and they're paying their employees in New York City 20 times that amount. So you tell me who's unethical. So these are the really difficult decisions and situations managers find themselves into. And so how do we talk about it? How do we address those issues? How do we help people not sign oaths or pledges, I will be a good leader, I'll be an ethical person? How do we help them make these decisions? What frameworks do we give people so they can process this stuff in real time? I think there's time for one more question. 2 questions from one person. 1 question, 2 people. I'm confused. Sorry. All right, sorry. Sorry.
My name's Richard. I'm a software engineer.
Hey, Richard.
And thank you. So I've been hearing that globalization is increasing automation, robots and mechanization increasingly as a technique for reducing cost of labor, which is a place that corporations can really help to profit.
Yeah.
What do you think? What are your thoughts as to where this is all going in terms of massive unemployment, underemployment, and fewer people having disposable income to purchase the products of companies and markets?
Yeah, I would first say that it's not always based on lowering cost. It's often the biggest driver is quality and reliability. So if I spend, $2 million on a machine, that's a lot of labor cost to amortize. So it's not always cost. Cost is often a factor, but it's quality and consistency, and this is very consistent with the movement to Six Sigma kind of factories and so on. Where does this go? I think humans are incredibly resilient, and people in their heart, most people, vast majority, want to work, and there's plenty of opportunities for people to work. But we need to be more creative, and we need to help those people engage in a society they don't necessarily understand. I don't think capital or equipment technology will displace the workforce. Individuals, yeah. But so long as people want to work, there's lots of opportunities. We have all kinds of technology in our house, and there's never a shortage of housework to do. It doesn't seem to go away. So I think we'll find solutions for it, creative solutions. I'm more worried about the people kind of at the bottom of the pyramid, the people who dropped out of school, who have become disengaged. Remotivating and helping those people believe enough in themselves and in their skill base to engage, I think, is going to be our biggest challenge. Great question. Last question, and then I think we're going to we'll do the punch bowl. Yes.
Hello, my name is
Mindy.
Mindy Stone. Yes,
Yeah,
and
hi.
I'm a Thunderbird undergraduate student. My question is, so since technology is developing so quickly and all this information we can't quite comprehend yet, but I notice, with my little cousin, she's 12 years old, she knows the internet and phones far better than I think I ever could. Will we ever be able to catch up to this technology, or will it just continue going and we'll never be able to catch up?
I don't think we're ever going to catch up to it. So she's 12 years old. She's already ahead of where you are.
Oh yeah,
And her 5-year-old sister's ahead of where she is. No, but we do have other skills. We do have other things we can add, and that's judgment, and that's experience, and that's perspective that they don't have. I am more concerned about developing those capabilities than I am about the millennials onboarding with different technologies. It's how do we transition from creating value from our technical acumen to our acumen associated with judgment and our ability to motivate and lead people. That's not technology-based. So I don't think we're ever going to get caught up. And the world, I think, will get increasingly complex. I think we're about out of time. I just want to close with just a couple of final comments. First off, thank you, our undergrads. For those who don't know, Thunderbird was founded 71 years ago as an institution that offered only undergraduate degrees. And we offered only undergraduate degrees for several decades until we flipped into graduate degrees